Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are going to give it a few minutes so that folks can join us from the waiting room. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the limited access to eviction records and unsheltered homelessness. Today's webinar is going to be a policy update, a statewide policy update on limited access to eviction records. Um, all right, before we get started, I just want to quickly talk about the Housing Alliance. We are a statewide coalition working to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable homes for all Pennsylvanians. Webinars are free for members, so become a member today. You can do that by visiting housingalliancepa.org/become a member or contact us at info@housingalliancepa.org for more information. Next slide. That is not the slide I wanted to go to. All right, so quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar will run for about 60 minutes, and that includes time for question and answer. We encourage you to leave questions to our incredible group of speakers today. If you do want to ask our speakers questions, please use the Q&A function. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is only to ask the Housing Alliance logistical questions about the webinar. So once again, use the Q&A function to ask questions to our presenters. We will email a recording of this presentation and any associated materials in approximately a week's time, so you can keep an eye out for that as well. We do webinars very regularly, and there are a couple of webinars that are upcoming that I want to talk to you about. We have a webinar on zoning reform that will be next week on February 19th. And then we have another one the week after that on February 25th on home repair programs in Pennsylvania. You can view these events and any upcoming webinars if you scan the QR code that's on the screen. All right, with that, I am going to hand it over to Phyllis, who is the Executive Director with the Housing Alliance. And Phyllis, here you go.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and hi, everybody. We today are going to, as Chris already said, talk about legislation to give renters a second chance by sealing their eviction court case records. We're going to talk about that first, and then we're going to talk about unsheltered homelessness. I do also want to make sure everybody knows that the governor did release his housing action plan this morning at a press conference in Philadelphia. We're not talking about that today, but I just wanted to make sure everybody knew. You can go directly to DCED's website to see a copy of the plan. Jen is also going to be sending out the information about the plan probably right after this webinar is over. And note that the Housing Alliance is working with a number of other statewide organizations to host another information session. We don't have a date yet, but we want to give everybody the chance to hear directly from the administration. This is a webinar, so we can't see you. And we'd love it if you would introduce yourself in the chat. And then note what Chris said about questions. I don't know if anybody thinks it's weird that we always insist not to use the chat for questions. And it's just because it's hard to keep track of questions in the chat. So if you have a question, we're more likely to be able to answer it if you put it in the Q&A. But again, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat so that we know that you're here, and so does Izzy. Jen, can you share the first slides? So very briefly, before I introduced Izzy, there's a lot of reasons why evictions are a bad consequence. They drive people into homelessness. They disproportionately impact race and ethnic minorities. But it's the third point that's really the focus of our discussion today and the focus of the legislation that Izzy has championed. We hear from people who've experienced, go back to the other slide, Jen, sorry. We hear from people that have experienced eviction, or even maybe the eviction didn't go through, but they received that eviction filing. We hear from them over and over again that in addition to it just being really hard to find housing that is affordable for them, Once they have that eviction record that landlords can see and it never goes away, it never clears, most of the time landlords won't rent to them. Landlords do get to pick and choose who they rent to. That's not what I'm suggesting needs to change. But I think most of us can recognize that this is really about fairness and giving people a second chance, especially given that the vast majority of evictions happen, and even the eviction filing happens because people can't afford to pay their rent. And we all know how hard it is to pay rent. We also have seen the skyrocketing price increases in rent all across the Commonwealth. Now you can go to the next slide. So, like I already said, those eviction records never clear, no matter what the outcome is. Next slide. So, what we're here to talk about today is legislation that Representative Smith Wade L. introduced in the House, HB 1095. It passed the House and it's awaiting consideration in the Senate. And then there is also companion legislation in the Senate. But given that Izzy's legislation already passed the House, we want all of us to put our weight behind passing his legislation so that the governor can sign it into law. And with that, we'll stop sharing. And Izzy, I will hand it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Phyllis. I just want to address first and foremost, yes, I am wearing a heavy coat. Unfortunately, the heat has gone out in my office, and I sent my staff home. But I am here because I wanted to be on this call with y'all, so I hope that you'll forgive the coat. It is exactly 32 degrees here in Lancaster. But hopefully we'll have that fixed soon. Um, anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with y'all and to be talking about HB 1095. And I want to ground us in what it actually means. Of course, like we call it the Ready to Rent Act or limiting access to eviction records or eviction ceiling. But what does that mean? Think you're all intimately aware, just based on your institutional backgrounds, on the impact that an eviction record can have on an individual, a household, or a family, or even unrelated individuals, because most folks on a lease are jointly and severably liable. So evictions will be filed against everybody in a given, pardon me, in a given unit. Anyway, the way that I put this to people is being a landlord myself. I have seen the background, the background check that we get back for many of the common background check services that landlords use. And there will be a section that says landlord tenant or landlord tenant history or eviction history, et cetera, which will tell you the parties involved, the date, and that there is a record. That background check won't tell a prospective landlord if it was a non-payment eviction or not. If it was a non-payment eviction, whether it was over $5,000 or $5,000, it won't say whether domestic violence was involved. And most importantly, it will not say whether the judge found finally in favor of the tenant. So in the slides that you saw that the overwhelming majority of landlords will not rent to somebody with a previous eviction filing. But some number of those were withdrawn or dismissed, or there was a final finding in favor of the tenant, meaning that the tenant was deemed to be legally not in the wrong, and the landlord was not granted possession of the unit, which is to say, every year in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, thousands of people are denied housing over evictions that did not actually happen. And I think that's important to understand when we understand why we're trying to change this. Like the housing crisis is vast, and we need people working in all areas. But the first things that we can do are clean up manifest injustices that can be fixed in easy technical ways, and this is one of them. Um, That being said, its impact is large. As many as 30,000 Pennsylvanians have a filing against them every year. And so the number of people who are being denied housing grows every year. And those are people with children and families. They're disproportionately likely to be moms with children. They're disproportionately likely to be African American or Latino. So the impact is clear, but I'll say it: there are people being made homeless when nothing happened to them. And I'm going to assume everybody on this call actually probably generally agrees that nobody should be made homeless. But we have an opportunity to make a change here in judicial proceedings that's going to help a lot of people stay housed. So HB 1095, our limited access to eviction records bill, passed out of the House last summer. It passed out of committee in a bipartisan fashion, passed out of the House in a bipartisan fashion, and now the work is to get it passed out of the Senate and to the governor's desk. Now, Phyllis mentioned that we're not talking about the governor's housing action plan, but we are a little bit because our legislation is there in the governor's action plan. And we're really happy to have the support of the administration. Currently, the bill has been referred to the Judiciary Committee. Now, I get a lot of questions: why Judiciary as opposed to Housing, or as the committee is called, Urban Affairs and Housing in the Senate? I think you could make a good argument that it belongs in either committee, but what it does technically is amend judicial procedure, amends the way in which our courts and their computer systems work. And so it goes to the Judiciary Committee, which is chaired by Senator Lisa Baker. Once it gets out of the committee, then we are relying on the Senate to run the bill. That'll be a trade between the two chambers, possibly part of budget negotiations. That's just how this goes. And I think at that point, we won't have to do any work to get the governor to sign a bill that he has already named as part of his housing action plan. So what I will say is our coalition has done a fair amount of groundwork in talking to various senators on both the D and R sides, pardon me, in both the Senate D and Senate R caucuses, just to get them familiar with the bill. And I think that we are in a place where if the bill were to run on the Senate floor, we have enough Republican support for the bill to pass. I think that right now we've got about 4 or 5 senators that we could get to vote for it in the Republican caucus, in addition to the whole Democratic caucus, and that would be enough to send the bill to the governor's desk. Where it is right now, what we need is for Chairwoman Lisa Baker to call up the bill and get it voted out of committee. And so that's what we're working on right now. So we're narrowing our communications right now, pardon me, to 2 places. And those are primarily to Senate Majority Leader Joe Pittman and Judiciary Chairwoman Lisa Baker, because those are the people charged with moving it forward. And if you wanted to throw a reminder towards the governor or to the office of House Floor Leader Matthew Bradford that this is a priority to make a trade for, that would be welcome as well. But really, we're focused on Senators Pittman and Baker. And really, what we need is for the bills to be called up, because I think our coalition has done the groundwork to get enough R's to get the bill voted out of committee and out of the Senate. As it comes up, it may be meaningful for y'all to know, and then I'll stop talking in a second, but it may be meaningful for y'all to know that we've been able to secure a broad base of support from labor unions like SEIU, from the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, from Community Legal Services, but also from stakeholders who are typically seen as being on the other side of the aisle. One of our primary supporters is the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors. And it was a lot of work to get them in a position to support the bill, as well as getting the lobbies that represent landlords in this Commonwealth, the Apartment Association, the Residential Owners Association, and the Manufactured Housing Association to a place of neutrality on the bill. So we feel good about the stakeholder work that we've done. We feel good about the member work that we've done. What we need now is to get the bill to run in committee. Um, yeah, and then just, for clarity, as is in the bill, the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, or AOPC, has asked for not insignificant lead time in the bill for the legislation to take effect, because they will be doing some rewriting of of the software that they use to manage judicial proceedings at the MDJ level. Okay, I'm going to stop talking for a second.
Great. So a couple questions. Can you talk a bit about the amendment that was made to the legislation on the floor of the House and how it changed the bill?
Trying to recall it.
It was a long
Um,
time ago.
yes, it was. So that amendment really includes two things. One, some cleaning up of technical language and some clarification of penalties. What we or let me back up a step. There's like a gold standard here that we want, and that is that evictions are made limited access at the moment that they are filed. That's thing one. Made limited access automatically after 7 years, even if the tenant is found to be at fault, and to be made limited access upon satisfaction of judgment. What does that mean? The judge decides, yes, tenant, you owe $2,000 and possession in the rare case where a tenant who has already had to move on to another apartment or home gets together the $2,000 to make their prior landlord whole. We would consider that, or the courts would consider that, satisfaction of judgment, and then their case would be sealed. Where our negotiations have put us is that we have evictions becoming limited access on the finding of a judge that the tenant was not at fault, and limited access after 7 years, which is going to put us in line with foreclosure and bankruptcy proceedings. As well, with the amendment, what we have is a clarification of our penalties, which I think that is to say, sorry, penalties for the knowing or inappropriate transfer of a file deemed limited access to a party who would not have access. So, for example, those court records prior to being sealed, are not limited access, right? That's a regular court record. But once they are made to be limited access, we expect all people with access to or copies of those records to behave as though they are now limited access because they are. And so the bill provides for a specific penalty. I believe it's the lesser of $5,000 or 2 months rent and court costs. Pardon me. If they say distribute that record, which they know has been sealed. So those are the things that are in the amendment that occurred on the floor in June. All other amendments were not agreed to and defeated.
So, I want to ask you about message. One of the
Sure.
messages that we found that resonates with both Democrats and Republicans is to compare this effort to the Clean Slate Law, which, for folks that don't know, was legislation that passed, I don't actually know how long ago, a while ago, that allows the expungement of criminal records for people with minor criminal convictions. So eviction is not criminal, but our experience was that this idea of second chances, maybe third, fourth chances, seemed to really resonate, and that the experience they had working on the clean slate legislation, it's almost as if they'd already grappled with it a little bit, right?
Right.
So can you speak to that? And also, what are messages, because message is so important, we have to start with message. What are some messages that you found, besides comparing it to the clean slate law, that resonate with members of both parties? Or maybe it's one message resonates with one party more so than the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of what message resonates sort of solely with Democrats is pretty obvious, but a message that we've found that works for both parties is there's a consumer protection angle to this. Like unaccountable entities buy this data from our courts and they distribute it inaccurately, right? Like there's a sort of a consequence of government argument that we have found to be meaningful or compelling to some of our Republican colleagues, right? Like no one thinks that the government should be in a position to punish someone for something that didn't happen, something that they never did. We also find that folks largely get on board with the idea that that 7 year part of the bill is in line with what we already do for bankruptcies and foreclosures, bad debt. Um, and then on the flip side, one of the sticking points that we've had that has been raised, and I'm going to argue that it was sort of raised in bad faith, is that there's no exception for evictions related to criminal activity in the bill. That's true, and there's a reason for that. And it's this: when a landlord does a background check, they pull the landlord tenant records. They also pull criminal records, which are maintained in a fully separate reporting system that this bill does not affect in any way. Landlords still have access to that information and are still able to use it in decision making processes. As a matter of fact, we have much more uniform criminal proceeding data in the Commonwealth than we do civil or landlord tenant. So that data is much more likely to be reliable than the data that we're talking about in the eviction section. And so that sort of exists as a red herring. And so, where it comes up, we want folks to be empowered to say, actually, when you pull that background check, the criminal record still comes up, and the landlord is still empowered to make a decision based on that information.
And that comment reminded me that there were a number of amendments that were attempted to your bill when it passed the House that were um, pretty bad. I'm trying to think of a more fancy word than bad. And they didn't pass. So it doesn't matter to the state of your bill now. But some of those stereotypes are a barrier when convincing some legislators. And I like to think of what could happen and how can we prepare for it. So do you have any thoughts about how we address, I mean, we're how we address in a meeting to get support for this bill, how we might address some of those stereotypes? Some of it might be I start with, maybe you just don't know that the vast majority of evictions are not because people didn't do something that they were supposed to do to meet the requirements of the lease. They just got behind in paying rent. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I what I try to tell people is that these are situations like eviction filings can come from situations that happen to almost anybody, and there's no reliability or consistency on when a filing is made. Um, some folks will file not because they want the tenant out, but as a method of compelling the tenant to pay. Some folks will file for eviction 10 days after rent is due, not 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. There's no order here. And so it's really impossible to say, hey, this person has an eviction filing, they were in the wrong. We don't know that, and for many of them, as we've heard, they weren't adjudicated. And then there are some other politics that trickle in. So, for example, there was an amendment requiring that would have required landlords to ascertain whether or not their tenant was a legal resident of the United States. And that's a part of a politics of a different thing that is going on right now in America. And the thing that I often come back to with a lot of this is what we're doing to make sure that the government is not unjustly tarring people's reputations and denying them housing is creating a process that is largely automated. Now, that's good for the tenants, it's good for justice, but it's also good for the cost of this implementation, right? Like every other piece of scaffolding actually increases the burden on the taxpayer to get this done. And so that's a message that we utilized in discussing the amendments, and it's one that we continue to use now.
Thanks. And then the next question is to clarify what you said about what happens currently in terms of what is public and how much of it is public. Is it the filing itself, or does it include the outcome?
Yeah, everything is public, but landlords aren't going down to the courthouse to verify individual records. They're not even pulling up individual case records in AOPC. They're applying to background check companies who buy the data in batches. They don't scrub it, they don't collate it. In many cases, they don't even Social Security match it, which is to say, that your housing application could be denied because you have the same name and date of birth as someone who has an eviction filed against them. We've actually seen that as a challenge that's walked through the door of our district office here in Lancaster. So what the bill really seeks to get at is how these records are distributed at scale. And what you get when you see, pardon me, the line on the background check results, that's not sharing detailed information of the case, allowing a landlord to make a fully informed decision. It is just, as you put it, sort of a scarlet letter that gets people's applications struck off the top of the pile.
And maybe this isn't something I need to reiterate, but I like reiterating things, which is that those records are also publicly accessible for a person's entire lifetime. And that's really one of the main points of this legislation. We're going to move on to unsheltered homelessness. We are going to then also talk about advocacy opportunities on both. But before we move on, I just want to say we really appreciate your leadership on this. This is a top policy priority for us at the Housing Alliance
Yeah.
because of for how long and how often we hear people talking about what a huge barrier this is. And I know I said people that have experienced eviction. We also hear it over and over from the nonprofits and the local government agencies that are trying to help people find a new landlord to rent to them. There's lots of barriers. Housing isn't affordable. Criminal history is a barrier. We're not tackling that here. but this is really a bigger barrier than people always realize. So thank you for your leadership on this. I will also say that for people who know Izzy, you probably know this, but you are not the kind of person that just sits back. You really work it, and you're really just appreciate how hard you're working to build bipartisan support to make this happen, because it's just so critical to giving people, to just taking away a major barrier so people can have housing where they can raise their families and be safe.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to shift to unsheltered homelessness, and then, as I said, we're going to come back to advocacy opportunities. So it has never been safe for people to be living outside ever, right? People often stereotype folks that are living outside as criminals, but what we actually know is that they are more often the victims of crime and assault when they are outside. I don't really think I need to preach to the choir here, but I feel very strongly about this. So I'm gonna say, just how people's health deteriorates, how unsafe they are. And so often people have tried to get help. There isn't enough help available. They don't know where to get help, etc. But we also know that it's become even more unsafe to be outside. The that threats at the federal level and also the rhetoric at the federal level has created conditions where we're hearing from people all across the Commonwealth that there are more sweeps by law enforcement. People in rural places are often moving further into the county away from services because they're having to hide. And there's increased community complaints, and communities don't know what to do. So we have a proposal for funding to provide additional resources to nonprofits and local governments that are working to help people live outside. And we've modeled it on a couple things. We've been talking to people across the state who are doing street outreach, or who are the head of the local continuum of care, or who are working in a local government agency that's working to address this problem. We've also looked at examples from other states where the approach has been to target resources to people living in encampments, with the idea that the best way to address encampments is to try to help people move out and to give them a better option, because they're there because they don't have options. So we're looking at funding for street outreach, for housing subsidies, for staff to provide case management and help people connect to long-term supports, and also to fund staff to be able to work with landlords to accept rental subsidies. So I want to hand it back to Izzy to talk a little bit about this effort and other ways that he has been working to address this rising concern around encampments, and the fact that people are trying to address it in a way that would have really terrible consequences for the very vulnerable people living outside. So back to you, Izzy.
Great. Yeah, absolutely, Phyllis. Thank you, and thank you for your partnership in helping to build this legislation and in some of our other efforts to protect our neighbors who are outside or unstably housed for whatever reason. Context, I used to work for the Lancaster County Coalition to End Homelessness. In 2021, HUD put out a piece of paper on encampments of homeless individuals. And that paper started by noting that in 2019, encampments of unhoused individuals had reached a level not seen in almost a century. And they sort of left what almost a century meant as an exercise for the reader. But what we're talking about is a level of encampments not seen since the 1930s, right? Like when we're talking about the scale of this issue. And we all know, we all live and work in communities, engage and work with elected officials, small business leaders, et cetera, who just want, quote unquote, the problem to go away. And then it's this uphill battle of, reasserting that in fact these are human beings with needs and personhoods, not problems to be solved or pushed around. And so we want to make sure that we're in a position to not just be complaining about this approach, but creating a series of alternatives and pathways to bring folks from encampments back into whatever housing exists in their communities to help generate new housing. And in fact, like creating this alternative pathway is even more crucial now. This legislation, once introduced, I think will be more important than it's been in a long time this year as the federal government, as you all know, I'm looking at your institutional affiliations, as the federal government retreats from investments in permanent supportive housing, which helps to house some of the folks with the most challenging co-occurrences. This is a piece of legislation that we're still fine tuning and we're still working on. Okay, what's the right model that will pass in this state that also won't create harm where it's intending to create good? And of course, we'll be in touch with you all once we have a final draft and a bill number, in which case I'd ask you to direct your advocacy to the chair of the housing committee, to the Commonwealth's new interagency council on homelessness, and to the governor. And once we get this bill out of the House, hopefully we can. By that time, we'll have a proof of concept from getting eviction sealing to the governor's desk and signed, and we'll be able to follow a similar pathway. Um, but I would just encourage all of you to use in the meantime, to use your institutional relationships, whatever pulpit you have, to try to move your municipalities in this direction anyway. Which is to say, when you're in those meetings, and sometimes it can be awkward and sometimes it can be challenging to say, okay, we want to move people or we want to break down this encampment. Sometimes it's as simple as asking, okay, but then where do these people go? What can we provide for them? Because I'll tell you, and again, I feel very much like I'm speaking to the choir. In Lancaster, as some of my neighbors who I know are on this call, you can follow in the newspaper the pathway of people losing their housing to sleeping in the park to having the encampment in the park cleared to finding themselves living far away from services and connection in the woods behind the Walmart 6, 7 miles out of town, and then to have that encampment cleared too. What happens? No one gets housing when their encampment is cleared. All that happens is they get pushed further and further from people like yourselves who are trying desperately to house them. So, just wherever you can, encourage your local governments to remember that, like, hot potato is not a game that we can play with people's lives and livelihoods.
Great, thanks. And for those of you that have heard me talk about this, I mention this all the time, but there is a toolkit that Invisible People created on messages that work when talking about criminalizing homelessness. For those of you that were at our conference, Mark Horvath spoke during one of the affinity lunches on the first day. It is really good. And they tested messages, and most of their point is that you have to talk about this issue, just like any issue, as it applies to the self-interest of the people that you are speaking to. And as an example, really starting with no one wants encampments. Homeless service providers don't want encampments either. But to Izzy's point, if we don't provide people with more options, they're simply going to go to another encampment, either further down the street, so it's still the same problem of the same municipality, or to another municipality, which doesn't resolve the problem at all. So thank you, Izzy, for also taking on this issue too. So I'm now going to pass it to Jen Thomas, my colleague here at the Housing Alliance, to talk about advocacy opportunities on both the eviction ceiling legislation and the unsheltered homelessness proposal that we just discussed.
Thank you, Phyllis. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So we have a couple of immediate actions you can do right now or take in the next few weeks to support both the Humane Encampment Resolution Strategy and advance HB 1095 for the eviction ceiling legislation. So the first thing you'll see here on the screen is signing on to our Humane Encampment Resolution Strategy sign-on letter. This can help us show clear statewide support for these evidence-based approaches that Representative Izzy and Phyllis went over. It'll take you less than 2 minutes. And please do note that this is an organizational sign-on letter. You can scan the QR code with your phone, or you can follow the link that I'm going to put in the chat. We will also be sending out these items after the webinar within a few days. So if you can't capture the information right now, you may be driving in your car. Don't worry, we'll make sure you get all of these links afterwards. Another way you can support this work is really help us lift up stories from people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We are collecting stories that are reflecting these real life experiences from people who are living without shelter in Pennsylvania. So if you or your organization have stories you're willing to share, anonymously is absolutely fine. Please send them to me. You'll see my email on the screen, and we will follow up with that information as well. We are especially interested in stories that help us challenge those common misconceptions, like why people might decline shelter, what living outside is actually like, and what supports could have made a difference for that individual. These stories really help inform our advocacy work and ensure that these policy conversations are grounded in lived experience. So if you have those stories, please send them to me. They don't have to be in perfect form. They could be bullet points, and I'm always happy to schedule a follow-up call with individuals to work on those stories as well. The next quick action you could do is sign on your organization to another letter. This is for HB 1095, the Fair Housing Access Sealing of Eviction Records. Again, you can follow the QR code with your phone or follow this link that I'm putting into the chat. Adding your name just strengthens our advocacy with our legislators. So the more organizations on this letter, the stronger the message. And last but certainly not least, we want you to join us March 25th in Harrisburg to meet with legislators about HB 1095. And if you can't travel, we can help you coordinate your meeting in district, especially with those target legislators that Representative Izzy mentioned at the beginning of this call. We will handle scheduling, we will provide prep and support and talking points, and help you craft your story to have an effective visit. I'm going to launch a poll so that you can indicate your interest, and then we will follow up with you afterwards based on the option you select. So you're able to come to Harrisburg, or you can't come to Harrisburg, but you would like to meet in district. Please select which option best works for you. And if you are in the car or driving and you're not able to participate in a poll right now, just send me an email and we can work with you that way as well. So I'm going to leave the poll open for about 30 more seconds.
I just want to jump in while people are thinking about how to respond to the poll, that for those of you who've worked with us before, you know this, we give you everything you need. Your job is really to talk about your experience in the work that you do. If you have lived experience that is particularly powerful, you don't need to be an expert on legislative process. You don't need to be an expert on even the details of the legislation. All you have to do is just tell your story and we can help you with that. I will also say I don't like making up stuff for people to do. It really does matter that we have, and Representative Smith Wade L has people locally talking to their legislators about how this will help their district. I know we don't always see that it matters, but again, I don't like to make up stuff for people to do. We wouldn't ask you if it didn't really make a difference.
Thank you, Phyllis. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for everybody who took the poll. We'll be following up with you in the coming weeks about this advocacy opportunity, and we'll be sending around the sign-on links and the information on the story collection as well. Thank you very much, and back to you, Phyllis.
So Izzy, I see that you answered a question about the Shelter First Act in the chat, but do you want to tell people about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, Senator Saval and I, introduced parallel legislation to end the criminalization of homelessness, and you might see that called Shelter First. You might see it called the Gloria Johnson Anti-Cruelty Act. Pardon me. So where that is that we have both introduced our bills in our respective chambers and are just working to get those taken up in our respective housing slash urban affairs committees in each chamber. So the work continues, but no special updates there.
Great. I just also want to go back to stories and I won't belabor the point. I don't like making up stuff for people to do. I know the stories sometimes take a little bit of work, but they really do matter. And I just want to give a shout out to Mark Borse with Access Services in Montgomery County, and also Abby, David, and Deanne at Lehigh Conference of Churches for the stories that you have given us. We want to be able to use those directly with legislators, but honestly, it makes what I say better because I can ground it in what your real experience is. And I also just want to say, I know that some of you are really in the thick of it, trying to figure out how to help people outside. It isn't that it isn't that it hasn't happened anywhere else recently, but in Allentown and Bethlehem, over the last couple months, they've really been in the thick of it with having to help people where people were being cleared out of an encampment really quickly. And I just want to say that I'm just so inspired by the work that street outreach workers do. You go out in the cold, you put yourself in situations that a lot of people wouldn't put themselves in because you realize how much people need you. So I just want to say that. I'll keep saying it. So thank you. Izzy, is there anything else you want to add?
Um, Nothing that comes to the top of mind, but thank you everyone for giving me some of your time today. I think you know how important this legislation is, and not just to the bill itself, and not just to the thousands of Pennsylvanians whose lives will be improved by these two bills. What I've learned in my time in government is that these issue areas build like snowballs, and we have to continue to make housing a priority. And every win strengthens our efforts for housing justice and adequacy in the Commonwealth. So, thanks for taking the time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. If you didn't fill out the poll or if you didn't click on the links, Jen will send out the links in the follow-up email that we always send. And hope to see you in Harrisburg. Hope to see you advocating for both of these issues. And thank you again. Have a good day, everybody.